Welcome back to Real Estate Simplified. Kayla, let's talk about some tips and tricks for landlords and tenants. What do you see as the most common issues these days that arise with tenanted properties?
The first issue is landlords not doing their tenant screening. You know, I think we get into our landlords who are not doing their proper full tenant screening on their tenants, and that's when the problems arise. So making sure that the landlords are doing their full-on credit checks themselves and not accepting it from tenants, because there's a lot of fraudulent credit checks that are happening. That is number one, you know, our landlords getting that. Now that you've got yourself a problem tenant because you didn't go through your proper checks, the number one issue that the landlords are dealing with is trying to evict a tenant in Ontario, either for non-payment of rent or for ruining the enjoyment of others, or even trying to evict them based on the owner trying to sell the properties. So we have a boatload of issues that you'll probably need an hour just to talk about one of them.
Yeah. Now on the flip side, because there are some pretty crummy landlords out there as well, what can tenants do to make sure that they're actually moving into a property that is going to be well cared for and the landlord's going to be responsive and all that sort of stuff?
That's a perfect question, because what you really want to do as you're checking out the rental unit is, one, if you're serious about filling in an application, it's about really interviewing the landlord, you know, saying, hey, if I have this situation happening, you know, what do I need to do as a tenant? And you can start understanding how that landlord's going to be by asking them those type of questions and how they're going to respond to you. And number two, if it is a multi-unit type of property, you can talk to the other tenants to be like, hey, how is the landlord? Is he good? Because this is just the tenants now doing their own due diligence to make sure that before they move into a spot, and making sure that they always know their rights as a tenant, knowing that if you don't want to be there, you can give that 60-day notice to vacate the premises if you're not liking what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Ryan, usually when things get over to you, you're well into the legal process. What are some other issues that you find that you have to deal with on your end as it relates to tenanted properties?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Number one thing that I normally find is, a couple things. One, there's no parameters within the agreement that mention anything about the tenant or they're lacking. So there's no clear direction on which party's giving the notice. Have they given the proper notices on the proper forms to the tenant under the LTB? That's probably a number one. There's just nothing in the agreement, right?
And actually, the lender will want to know that there's a tenant in the property too. So that opens up another can of worms.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, so that's one thing, right? Is just the agreement not probably spelling out enough legal language to support what's happening with tenants if they are in fact going to be in the property on closing, or do they have to be removed? And is that removal happening as per all the required steps under the legislation? Proactively, I like the approach of, if you can, deal with the tenant ahead of time if you don't want to have the property with a tenant in it, right? If the tenant's going to stay because it's a value add to the deal, well, okay, that's great, that's fantastic. Let's just make sure there's parameters within the agreement that talk about that tenant staying, rent rolls being disclosed, leases being provided as due diligence, right?
Yeah. Now, on the subject of leases, Ontario a number of years ago came out with the standard lease that everybody has to use for residential properties. Can people add to that standard lease? Because I know, some landlords want to have very specific items listed there. Is that doable now?
Yeah, so there's the body of the lease. It's like 2 pages, I think, maybe 3 tops, and it's a standard document. You can't really do a lot of editing to that at all. Where we have been able to kind of add some language that's not contrary to the legislation and the regulations is in the schedule. So we do have sort of a boilerplate or precedent material that we know is acceptable by the tribunals and the arbitrators at the LTB that we can put in that more or less are a bit more protective of the landlords. The legislation is very protective of tenants already, so the addendums or amendments we can add to the lease is more protective to help our landlord clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kayla, speaking of the Landlord Tenant Board, what are the issues these days? Because you're a huge advocate. So what are you dealing with the Landlord and Tenant Board, and what sort of changes are forthcoming?
Well, they made some really good changes that we were really hopeful with regarding the more Navigate Tribunals Ontario. So it gives landlords and the tenants the portal and where they can put their question, like there's a bunch of questions, you can click on it if it applies to you, and then start guiding you to the resources and where you should be looking as a landlord or tenant. Then they got into the Ontario Tribunal portal, where now landlords and tenants are going to be able to file their L1, L2 applications or their T2, T6 applications in a portal. And that will be a communication portal as well between the landlord and the tenant. You'll stay in there for approximately 2 weeks. It's been a lot longer, so we talk about growing pains. And then you have your concept of a dispute resolution officer. So if a landlord and tenant are in this portal and you're talking about the issue at hand between the L1, the L2, the T2, or the T6, and you come to an agreement on your own just by being in this portal, you can push a little button and then the dispute resolution officer will come in, read everything through, confirm everything, and put out a consent order. So it was a way for them to try to stop a lot of the cases, all cases, being heard by an adjudicator. So if you never come to an agreement, then you will be put into the wait time, waiting for an adjudicator. So which was really good. You can pay for your hearing dates through there, and you can submit your evidence through this portal. But I think they're still going through a lot of growing pains at the same time, and they're still dealing with this huge backlog that was happening well before COVID, and I don't think, and with a new change, they had a new change with an associate chair. So obviously they need to get their feet underneath them and figure out exactly what the issues are and pick up where the last associate chair left off. So it's been it's a challenge, and you can see in headlines it's still a growing issue for the community of landlords and tenants.
Yeah. And now you threw out a couple acronyms or short forms for forms.
Yeah.
What does all that stuff kind of mean? Because if somebody's sitting at home, they might not know what a form is. So can you just walk us through what are the standard forms and why they're there?
So the L1, the L2 applications are going to be either for, so the way the Landlord and Tenant Board works is that there's a whole bunch of N forms for the landlord. So if you file an N form, your form that you would be filing is your L1 application, so your form to end the tenancy. But if you file an N5, which is the tenant who is interfering with other tenants, that would have to result in an L2. So where we talk about how we kill a tree every time we're trying to file paperwork at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And then the tenants, it's either for the tenant's maintenance issues or tenant's rights. These are the two main forms that they use, and so they will have to use those forms when filing. And they're going to be getting more of our file forms that we do file now. They will be allowing landlords and tenants to upload them into this portal as well, and that's becoming, more changes are going to be coming in the spring, which the spring is here. So hopefully we'll see what else, other changes are happening, but again, they still have a lot of growing pains.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, Kayla, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today. This was great.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today on Real Estate Simplified. I'm Seth Ferguson, and I'll see you next time.